As you can see, the title is quite controversial. The Muslims are going to be upset. Let me tell you what I'm not saying. I am not saying that Muslims knowingly worship the false god Baal. If you're familiar with the Old Testament, you'll note that the main competitor for the worship and allegiance of the Israelites was the false god Baal. All throughout the Old Testament, you'll find God chastening, disciplining, rebuking, punishing, even exiling his people for their habitual habit of turning to the false god Baal. The name Baal also pops out in the New Testament under the name Beelzebub. If you read Mark 3, for instance, 22 all the way 30, the Jews accused Jesus of casting out demons by Beelzebub, the prince of demons. The word Baal means Lord, husband, or master. This was the main chief competitor that Satan used to get the Israelites to forsake God, their love for God, a devotion to God, and worship this false god. In fact, Baal is simply Satan's disguise. Because if you go with what the Jews said, Mark 3, 22 to 30, Beelzebub is the prince of demons. But the prince of demons would be Satan. So here, if the Jews are right and Jesus didn't correct them, that means Beelzebub, Baal, is simply another name of Satan. Because there's only one ruler of demons, Satan. He rules the kingdom of darkness. All evil spirits are subject to him. So if Beelzebub is the ruler of demons, then that means that's another name for Satan, because Satan has various names. Satan, the devil, Belial, Beliar, the serpent, the dragon. These are his names. So that means Baal is simply Satan appearing as a god in order to mislead people from worshiping the true God. Now, if that's true, Allah is simply another name for Baal, and Islam is simply another form of Baal worship, then that actually further confirms Islam is the religion of the devil. It's Satan's religion that Satan inspired through Muhammad to be the competitor against Judeo-Christianity. And that would make sense, right? Because all throughout Old Testament history, the chief competitor to Yahweh, Yahovah, was Baal. Right now, as we speak, the chief competitor, the chief religion competing for the devotion of the hearts and minds of not just the world, but of Jews and Christians, is Islam. So it's like history repeating itself. As Solomon said in the book of Ecclesiastes, nothing new under the sun, the same lie, the same deceit, the same trickery being promoted throughout the ages, but under different disguises, repackaged. It's the same deceit, but repackaged. That doesn't mean Muslims know they're worshiping Baal. That's the deception. That's the deceit. Just like when the Israelites worshiped Baal, they didn't think they were worshiping Satan. They still were worshiping demons nonetheless. Deuteronomy 32, verses 16 to 17. Talking about the Israelites, they provoked him to jealousy with strange gods. With abominations, provoked him to anger. They sacrificed unto devils, not to God, to gods whom they knew not, to new gods that came newly up, whom your fathers fear not. Did you catch it? The Israelites were sacrificing to devils, to demons, though that's not what they thought they were doing. Similarly, Muslims don't think they're worshiping Baal. They think they're worshiping the true God of Abraham, and that's the deceit of Satan. Satan doesn't care whether you know you're worshiping him or not. In fact, he doesn't care whether you acknowledge he exists or not. He doesn't even care if you're an atheist. He just doesn't want you to know the true God and the true gospel, because that's the only way you can escape him and overcome him. Fact number one, Hubal was the chief deity, the chief god of Mecca and of the shrine, the Kaaba. That's the first fact. Fact number two, Hubal was actually Baal. Hubal, and the Muslim sources will testify, was actually the Arabic name for Baal. Some people believe Hubal either comes from Hubal, he is Baal, two Arabic words, or it is an Arabicized corruption of the Hebrew words Ha-Baal, the Baal. The third fact, the sources don't come out and say it, but that's the logical, necessary inference. Hubal was Allah, Allah was Hubal. If you actually read, quote unquote, between the lines, you're going to see Hubal was Allah, Allah was Hubal. So are you now ready to dig in? I want to give you a little background on the pagan religion in Mecca. Medina, that's Arabia. Mecca, according to the Muslim sources, is the place where Muhammad was born. The Quraysh tribe, which was an Arab tribe that lived in Mecca. And according to the Muslim sources, I'm quoting the late Abdullah Yusuf Ali in his translation of the Quran. He admits that the Arabs before Muhammad and during the time Muhammad were into astral worship, where they worshiped the sun and moon and 5 planets because they thought there were only 5 planets. Now let's do the math. Sun, moon, 5 planets, that's 7, right? Now, in many cultures, the sun was the male deity and the moon was the female consort, the female deity. Not in Arabia. In Arabia, the moon was the male deity and the sun was the female deity. And the sun was the consort, the wife of the moon. Let me read what he says. This is a Muslim. Now, he's passed away, but he admits this. To revert to the worship of the heavenly bodies, okay? A few individual stars did attract the worshippers' attention. So the Arabs worship Sirius, the dog star, the brightest fixed star in the heavens with a blush tinge in its light. It is probably Sirius that is referred to as the fixed star in the parable of Abraham. With regard to the fixed stars and their myriads, the astronomers turned their fancy to devising groups or constellations. Now, here's where it's going to get relevant, okay? But the moving stars are planets, each with a motion and therefore will or influence of its own, right? As they knew and understood them, they were 7 in number. That's what they thought, 7. And now he tells you what the 7 are. Viz, 1 and 2, the moon and the sun. So count. The 2 objects which most closely and indubitably influence the tides, the temperatures, and the life in our planet. 3 and 4, the 2 inner planets, Mercury and Venus. So that's 4 so far, which are morning and evening stars and never travel far from the sun. 5, 6, and 7, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, the outer planets whose elongation from the sun on the ecliptic can be as wide as possible. The number 7 itself is a mystical number, as explained in note 5526. Okay, now, notice what he's going to say. It will be noticed that the sun and the moon and the 5 planets got identified, associated with, each with a living deity, god or goddess, with characteristics and qualities of its own. Now, before I read the rest of the part, did you catch what he just said? This is a Muslim whose Quran translation was widely circulated and distributed in the 20th century. The Arabs in Mecca, in Arabia, but in Mecca, worship the sun and moon and 5 planets as 7 gods and goddesses. You're going to see the relevance in a minute. And I hope I don't put you to sleep here. The Arabic word for the moon, qamar, is of the masculine gender. And on the other hand, the Arabic word for the sun, shams, is of the feminine gender. The pagan Arabs evidently looked upon the sun as a goddess and the moon as a god. So the Arabs in Mecca, they viewed the moon as the male god and the sun as the female god, or the goddess. That's going to be important. Okay, folks, let me bring out the implication. The sources teach that the Kaaba in Mecca in Saudi Arabia was a shrine that housed 360 idols. This is in the Muslim sources. It's not non-Muslim sources. The Muslim sources also admit the pagans before Muhammad would perform what they call the rites of pilgrimage, Hajj and Umrah, meaning they would come to the Kaaba, and those who lived there didn't need to travel, and the pagans would run around it 7 times. 7 times. Something Muslims do to this day. Muslims adopted these practices from the pagans. And then there are 2 hills in Mecca called Safa and Marwa. And they'd run between these hills 7 times. 7 times. And the Muslim sources say that at one time there were 2 idols on both hills. There was an idol here and an idol there, and they'd run 7 times. Now, folks, can I ask you a question? Why did the pagans run 7 times between the 2 hills, Safa and Marwa, and run around the Kaaba 7 times? Practices which Islam adopted, Muhammad observed, and Muslims continue to this day. But why did the pagans do it? They did it in worship of the gods and goddesses, the 7 planetary deities. Thank you. So, folks, why in the world did Muhammad continue that practice? And why are Muslims running around the Kaaba 7 times and between the 2 hills 7 times, all of which even the Muslim sources admit were practices that the pagans observed because they believed in the sun and moon and 5 planets as god and goddesses that they had to worship and venerate? Why are the Muslims still doing it? Do you want to hear what their silly excuse is? Because Ishmael settled in Mecca, and Abraham came and visited Ishmael, and Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba as the first house of worship. And so Ishmael taught them these practices, but as time went on, his descendants corrupted these practices and then attached them to gods and goddesses. So originally it was practices done for Yehovah, the worship of Jehovah. But then the descendants of Ishmael corrupted themselves, became idolaters, and then corrupted the practices and attached them to their gods and goddesses. Are you buying that version of history? And is it a coincidence that Ishmael told them, hey, run between the 2 hills 7 times, run around the Kaaba 7 times, and somehow, magically, 7 becomes the number of the gods and goddesses that the pagans worship because they thought there were 5 planets in the sun and the moon. Gee, what a coincidence. Let alone all the historical archaeological evidence refutes the claim that Ishmael went to Mecca. Because if you believe in your Bible, Genesis 21:21, it says Ishmael settled in the wilderness of Paran, and Paran is around Egypt and Canaan. It's not in Mecca. And Genesis 21:21 says that Ishmael married an Egyptian because his mother Hagar was from Egypt, and she got him a wife from Egypt. So he never settled in Mecca, and he didn't marry an Arab woman and sired the Arabs in Mecca. This much the Muslims admit. Now, folks, let me add another thing as we get into the evidence. You remember what the source just stated? I just read Abdullah Yusuf Ali. He said to the Arabs, the moon, the Arabic word qamar, is masculine, denoting the fact that the Arabs viewed the moon as the male deity. meaning it was the planet, the astral object associated with the chief deity. And remember, the Arabs are what they call patriarchal society, meaning the male is the chief. So their god has to be male. He's the chief. The moon is the planet representing the chief male deity of their pantheon. You with me there? The sun is the female. The sun represents the female, the goddess, that's the wife of the male deity. Follow with me. The chief deity is supposed to be Allah. He's the chief deity. He's the male deity. Well, if the moon was viewed as masculine, Qamar, and it's the male deity, or the planet, or the object associated with the male deity, that means you just established that for the pagans, Allah was the moon god. Oh my goodness. If we